system. In addition, both Freudians and Marxists can explain why some people do not accept their theories. Anyone who refuses to see that sex is all-pervasive reveals a symptom of Victorian sexual repression. Perhaps he has an Oedipus complex and seeks to hide it by denying its existence in anyone. Anyone who denies that he is exploited as a tool of capitalist repression. To oppose such theories is to expose oneself to public scorn in some circles. Genetic explanations abound in common popular argumentation. The contempt of the business world for the academic world is explained as the awareness that those who can do, those who cannot teach. The contempt of the academic world for the business world is explained as the awareness that business is based on greed instead of benevolence. Adolescents simply cannot speak to anyone over 25. Age functions here as a genetic explanation of political, social, and cultural blindness. All rebellious youth are to be dismissed as the result of permissive parents. Given a sympathetic audience, you can also find some explanations as to why the opposition is so stupid, and save yourself the trouble of having to deal logically with its arguments. We come now to the second possibility, namely where the audience is still undecided. Here you should avoid using most of the techniques mentioned above. Instead, you should once more try to discover which points in your opponent's presentation were strongest and which were weakest. If you can combat the strong ones, then do so. If not, simply act as if they were never mentioned. In any case, the weak points should be exploited. The exact anatomy of proceeding to do so will be discussed shortly. The third possibility is what to do if your opponent has been successful. To begin with, moral posturing, calculated to shame your opponent and audience, is very effective when you are the obvious underdog in a dispute. Now, if your opponent's success is owing to his use of techniques of deception, such as those we are discussing, you can probably win points by exposing this fact and accusing him, more or less gently, of being a trickster. But if your audience is so dim-witted that it would not see what you are driving at, you should stick to using the deceptive tricks yourself. Above all, do not be so harsh with your opponent as to increase the audience's sympathy for him. And do not give the appearance yourself of being crafty or nitpicking. Most audiences immediately dislike someone who seems impressed with his ability to argue, so avoid looking oppressively flashy or pleased with your incisiveness or wit. Strive to look like a slightly wounded, unjustly used underdog, but again, don't overdo it. Know your audience. If your audience is somewhat sophisticated, but perhaps taken in by your opponent's skillful presentation, then you should expose him as a sophist and a trickster who is insulting the intelligence of the audience. You then engage in a point-by-point critique of his tricks. Finally, after the expose, you claim that you shall not stoop to using such dishonest means. Anatomy of refutation. We come now to the anatomy of refutation, the means whereby we undermine the case of the opposition. Remember, all of your opponent's arguments can be shown to be defective. It is simply a question of your ingenuity and persistence. Every argument consists of a major point or conclusion, supported by premises or reasons that allegedly provide evidence for the conclusion. When attacking an argument, we are claiming one of two things, or perhaps both. An argument is defective, 1, when the evidence contradicts the conclusion, or 2, when the evidence is simply false or inadequate. Since A above will be subdivided, let us examine B first. B. An argument is internally self-contradictory, either when one of the premises contradicts the conclusion or when the premises contradict each other. One of the classic cases of exposing a contradiction occurs in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. Recall that a contradiction exists when the speaker makes two statements, both of which cannot be true at the same time. Socrates, in that dialogue, asks Euthyphro the following question: what is the meaning of the term piety? Euthyphro answers that an act is pious when the gods approve of it, and impious when the gods disapprove of it. Socrates then points out to Euthyphro that since there are many gods, in Greek mythology at least, and since some gods will approve of an act and some gods will disapprove of the same act, then the same act will be both approved and disapproved at the same time. Therefore, if we use Euthyphro's definition of piety, the same act will be both pious and impious at the same time. Euthyphro, clearly has contradicted himself. An argument may be inconsistent with objective fact when either the premises or reasons appealed to are simply false, or the implications or results of the conclusions would be considered false. An example of the latter would be an argument that begins with information about industrial pollution and then concludes with a condemnation of all technology as being harmful to human life. The false implication of this position are apparent in that a great deal of modern medicine which preserves and serves life is the result of technology. Surely we would not want to reject this when making such a blanket condemnation. Reasons or premises are false or unacceptable, either when the conclusion does not follow, or when we can simply show the premises to be false. In the case of the conclusion not following, we say that the argument is a non sequitur. This differs from the earlier case, because in the earlier case we have a contradiction, whereas in the case of the conclusion not following, there is no connection at all. For example, one may argue to the conclusion that Americans as a whole have greater innate intelligence now than they did 40 years ago because there are more Americans attending college now than ever before. To do so is to offer a reason that is true, but totally irrelevant to the conclusion. There is no direct connection between innate intelligence and attendance at a college. The colleges may have lowered their standards or expanded facilities for reasons that have nothing to do with the intelligence of applicants. A reason or premise can be seen to be false in either a direct or indirect way. In a direct way, if someone claims that it is raining, we might show that he is wrong directly by looking outside. A reason or premise may be shown to be false indirectly in a number of ways. Let us consider the argument that 18-year-olds should be allowed to drink alcohol. Let us further suppose that the sole reason or premise offered is that liability to the draft should be the sole determining factor in giving the right to drink. Usually, it is stated in some highly emotional form like, we're old enough to die for our country, but not old enough to drink. The first way of attacking this premise is to add another premise that is known to be true, and then derive a false conclusion. Obviously, this invalidates the premise. For example, women are not subject to the draft, so we would have to exclude them from drinking. Obviously, being subject to the draft cannot be the sole determinant in arriving at a socially acceptable drinking age. The second way of attacking this premise is to derive another conclusion that would be inconsistent with the given conclusion or some other conclusion that your opponent may draw. For example, if the draft age were lowered to 16, then 16-year-olds or 12-year-olds or whatever the draft age is would have the right to drink. But your opponent has argued that drinking should begin at age 18. The same sort of inconsistent conclusion would work with the voluntary army. Then no one but the volunteers would have the right to drink. A third general method of attacking this premise is to show that it is a generalization with known exceptions, hence it is unacceptable. Liability to the draft is no present criterion for drinking since men over 35 who are obviously not subject to the draft have the right to drink. Drinking then depends on some other criterion or criteria. All of this is not to say that 18-year-olds should not have the right to drink. The refutation only shows that liability to the draft is not the premise or reason that can be used. In general, assumptions can be attacked in one of three ways. Either the assumptions overlook, evade, or distort certain facts. We overlook facts when we fail to note that there are exceptions to certain rules, when we use one rule in a situation in which another rule is more applicable, when we engage in sweeping generalizations and claim that what is true in some cases is true in all cases, when we make hasty generalizations that is insufficient for the basis of the generalization, or when we insufficiently bifurcate an issue. In the case of the latter, we set up alternatives that might not be exclusive. For example, the statement that you are either with me or against me is a case where the alternatives are not so exclusive. Sometimes we see this kind of argument in the claim that either you are in favor of affirmative action in the form of quotas or you are unwilling to fight discrimination. Clearly, there is another alternative, namely the desire to adopt anti-discrimination measures that do not in themselves engage in reverse discrimination. We evade facts and our assumptions when we beg the question,